Hi, thanks for taking an interest in this podcast and having a listen. In this podcast, I talk about the mental barriers that we face in our lives and how real they are, and some of the ways to overcome them. I also talk about the Iceman, which is something that is quite interesting. I hope you enjoy listening as much as I enjoyed the discussion. This podcast was recorded as a series of lectures given to people in 12-step addiction treatment. The purpose was to teach, motivate, and inspire people to search for their own spiritual solutions to their addictions. Please feel free to contact me if you need any more information. Thanks. Who knows who Roger Bannister is? Who's ever heard the name of Roger Bannister? Roger Bannister was the guy who broke the 4-minute mile. He did it in 1956. He was the first person to do it. Now there was a chap before him who had really been hammering. He was a runner, a guy by the name of John Landy. John Landy was a runner, and in the 50s, it's not like it is today, where we have professional athletes who have teams behind them and coaches behind them and that kind of thing. It was an amateur sport. People had their jobs that they did, and then as a hobby, they would run or box or do athletics or their sport or whatever it is. Very, very different way of doing things in the 50s as opposed to the way things are done now professionally. And John Landy was the quintessential runner. So he used to run. And he wanted to break the 4-minute mile. He put everything into it. And the way that he trained was by running more and pushing himself more. And they hadn't yet started with this whole business of interval training and these kind of things of looking at sport in a scientific fashion, breaking it up into ways of pushing your limits to reach even greater potential. And the belief was, and this was a belief that was held for hundreds of years, because the 4-minute mile was a thing. It was still very much where people were working in the imperial system. So the mile was the standard unit of measurement. Now we do the metric system. And the metric system nowadays, which takes precedence, is the 1,500 meters. Yeah. That's the kind of the equivalent of the mile. So that's surpassed the mile as something that is seen in athletic events. And the belief was that for somebody to run the 4-minute mile, they would actually die if they did it. It was scientifically and medically believed that it was physically impossible for anybody to do it. Could not be done. But these guys were constantly pushing themselves. If I'm not mistaken, John Landy, when he retired from running, became a businessman. I think he was doing something in sales. I'm not 100% sure. And he also became a politician. He was the governor of some state or something. So that was kind of like where his business interests lay. Roger Bannister was a doctor. And he wasn't the same type of runner as John Landy. He didn't spend as much time running as John Landy did. But what he did was he started investigating different ways of training to break the 4-minute mile. So he was the guy who came up with the theory of VO2 max. I know VO2 max from aerobic classes at the gym. I had a brief look at what VO2 max is, the volume of oxygen that you take into your system, and there's only so much oxygen that you can take into your system, and there's a level of performance associated with that, and any performance above and beyond that is above your VO2 max threshold. You push yourself, so oxygen equals a specific amount of performance. So that's something along the lines like that. I'm not 100% sure. Not really what the point of the whole discussion is. But he was the guy who started developing VO2 max, and he was also instrumental in the start of learning how to do interval training and pushing himself beyond his limit, specifically with this one objective in mind. Now, interestingly, when he retired from running, he became a neurologist, started working as a neurologist in medicine, and that's how he finished his career so when he retired from running, that's what he went and did in the same hospital. And there was always the belief that the conditions would have to be perfect for someone to break the 4-minute mile. It would have to be a calm, sunny day with no wind, perfect conditions. And something quite interestingly that I didn't even realize, something that I absolutely just did not know, is that the reason why they do running on an oval track is like if the wind is blowing in a specific direction, then you're running behind the wind and into the wind, and the wind is getting you from all directions. So it makes it a better test of a person's ability, as opposed to somebody who runs with a gale force wind behind them. Now, I've done that on my bicycle. I've cycled into the wind and I've cycled with the wind against me, and it makes a huge difference to the amount of effort that needs to be exerted. And the day that Roger Bannister broke the 4-minute mile, I think he broke it with 4 seconds, if I'm not mistaken. With 4 seconds. 4 seconds or 6 seconds. It was a really crap day with bad weather, stormy, unpleasant day. And he was the first one to do it. Now, what is significant for me around that is the whole medical belief at the time was that it couldn't be done. It was impossible. People had been trying for a very, very, very long time to break this barrier, and he did it. And John Landy had been trying to break this barrier for a very, very long time, and he couldn't do it. But in a race, 6 weeks after Roger Bannister broke the 4-minute mile, John Landy broke the 4-minute mile. So it was just like one after the other that the record was broken. So they've come to view this specifically as a mental block. There was a mental block around that 4-minute mile, and it kind of seems to be still a thing today. If you beat the 4-minute mile, then you kind of in the big leagues. If the record, which is current, was set in 1999, so that's 19 years ago that record was set, and it's how much is it? 3 minutes and 43 seconds. So that's a 17-second improvement that has been made since 1956 to 1999. Not long after Roger Bannister broke the 4-minute mile, like I said, John Landy then broke the 4-minute mile, and then they had a competition between the two of them. Obviously, they were riding the crest of the wave because this was a huge accomplishment. It was in all the news. These guys got so much press and so much publicity out of doing this that they then competed against each other. And the person who broke the 4-minute mile the first time won that race. Roger Bannister beat John Landy. And there was another chap who was trying to get in, a guy by the name of Wes Ante, but he was banned from running for whatever reasons, and he ended his career when they found him. He was working in a funeral home as a mourner, like a surrogate mourner in a funeral home. And he was and he was very, very bitter about being disqualified for competing because he felt that he was at the peak of his career at that time. I'm not certain about the circumstances, but it was the three of them that were the top competitors at the time that were pushing to break this record. And what is interesting for me, there's a few very interesting things around that. The first one is when the record fell, when it was seen that somebody could do it, then a lot of people started doing it. Not rapidly, because we're talking about people who are competing at absolutely the top level. These are high performance athletes performing at their peak performance in the peaks of their careers. And it was on an average of in the beginning, every 2 to 3 years that somebody would take a few seconds off the time and then make a new record. So it was the record was broken in 1954, and then it was broken in 1957, and then it was broken in 58, and then 62, and then 64. So it wasn't like, all of a sudden the records just started. People had to really work hard and really push themselves to set those new world records, just like any world record. The thing that I look at, which is the most fascinating aspect for me, is the way that Roger Bannister did it. So, first of all, he approached it from a very, I want to say it's scientific, but a very measured perspective. He was measuring his performance, and he was looking at what was going on in his own physiology to see what he could do, what was available to him. And he had two guys that he worked with that helped him break the record. And when he broke the record the first time, he used them as pacers. And what a pacer does is these two guys. There was an element of slipstreaming that was taking place. I don't know how much of that is possible in running, but if you look at the competition between Lannister and Landy and Bannister, I don't know how much of that was taking place. But these two guys would drag and they would push him, so they would be behind him and in front of him the whole time, coaching him and pushing him to go further. So Roger Bannister looked at this attempt as a team effort. John Landy was very much a loner, and he would keep meticulous notebooks about all his training, and he really was very disciplined around that stuff. But I would say that certainly from maybe not a good way of looking at it. Let me rather say there are two ways to approach a challenge, and the one is to do it yourself. Now, it's not like a record like this is something that is happening all the time, and you're looking at people who have a significant amount of willpower and dedication to their cause to achieve their goal and their objective. And as we all know in our society, I mean, we're all sitting here in this room, is that different people have been given different amounts of ability and willpower in various aspects. So then it comes down to a question of, is my past showing me that this is something that I can do by myself? Am I able to do this? Or if I need to push myself beyond the limits that I need to go, do I need to have people with me, helping me and supporting me and coaching me through this process? Which one is it? You know, where does my strength lie? So that to me is very fascinating, because I view myself potentially as somebody. I like to work with people, and I like to have people around me, and I don't mind. It's uncomfortable and it can be unpleasant asking for help, but I do it, and I believe that it's very beneficial for me, that I can keep striving, that I can keep moving, and that I can keep recovering, because I've tried going it alone and doing it on my own, and I'm not very good at that. I'm not very successful at doing it that way. And part of what I'm talking about here as well is I'm talking about psychological barriers, because that's what the 4-minute mile was. The 4-minute mile wasn't an actual barrier; it was a psychological barrier. And to repeat what I said is as soon as one person broke it, it's something that had been in place for hundreds of years. It kept happening. So the purpose of the discussion is obviously we're sitting here in the treatment center, and the primary reason, or the thing that we're trying to teach here, is the thing that I'm trying to teach is you can't do this alone. And there are other people who have recovered from alcoholism and from addiction, no matter how bad it has gotten. No matter, I heard a guy once say on a CD share, there's a low below the low you know. It can always get worse, trust me. It can always get worse. And as I mentioned in the last group, I mentioned that entropy is a law. Entropy is a law. It's a reality of life. Things are going to disintegrate. Things are going to not automatically get better. They are going to automatically want to pull apart. The example that I use is if you have a boiling jug of water and you put it in the table, it's going to cool down. There's nothing that we can do about it. That means that the challenge that we are facing is constantly striving and constantly working against entropy, because it's always pulling at us. That's why it's so hard. That's why it's so difficult. The struggle of our life, the battle of our life. Now, I heard something that was completely fascinating to me. Who doesn't know who Plato is, the philosopher? You don't know who Plato was. Plato, I wish I'd researched it a little bit more. Plato, when was Plato around? He was like 2,000, many thousands of years before BC, before Jesus. Philosopher. Probably one of the most famous philosophers. There was Plato, there was Aristotle, and something that Plato said is, and what fascinates me so much about this is we're talking more than 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago. The Greek people were talking about what we're talking about right now. This exact same stuff. Our lower nature, this is what Plato said, in a very abbreviated way. I don't have a philosophy degree, but that's not going to stop me from trying. Our lower nature seemingly seems stronger than our higher nature. And our struggle, our journey, is to overcome our lower nature to achieve the goals of our higher nature. So when we talk about our lower nature, Mila, who was here yesterday, I'm convinced she would have touched on this stuff. The cravings of our physical being, our lower nature. Now, as far as I grasp it, in essence, what we're doing is we fighting ourselves. So, one example is with sugar. Our bodies need sugar for energy, glucose for energy. But then we go completely overboard with something like sugar. It's a necessary part of the metabolic function. We function better when we have it. If you're tired and you're drained and you have a banana or apple or sweets or whatever, you have more energy and you can go. Your brain needs glucose to shift into that next gear of thinking. One of the examples that they give is that people going in front of the parole board 2 or 3 hours after breakfast and after lunch have a 50% worse chance of being granted parole for no other reason than the people on that parole board are mentally exhausted. If you have to use your willpower, they've done tests on this, if you have to use your willpower to stop yourself, so you have a bag of marshmallows there as an example, and you're busy, as part of an experiment, have to use your willpower not to dive into that bag of marshmallows and eat that bag of marshmallows, and you're given another test to test your willpower, you'll fail that test. If your working memory is being occupied with resisting and trying to stop yourself from doing something. That's why I believe, and I believe this so firmly, is that any person who says to me, I've learned my lesson, I will never do this again. The next time something like this happens, I will remember what happened the last time and I won't do it again. It is such rubbish. It's impossible. The amount of times people have said that to me and the amount of times that has failed beyond measure. You can't use your short-term, you can't use your working memory to remember the whole time what it is that you need to do. It needs to become a working part of your life. But that's a whole tricky debate. I guess that's really where the whole question of recovery comes in. Do I need to remember that I need to be in recovery? Do I need to constantly practice the principles of recovery so that I can stay in recovery? Do I need to apply the spiritual teachings of meditation of surrender, of letting go, to achieve recovery? What is it? Where does it all fit in, and how does it go? Another example then is procreation. So we're fighting our nation. We need to procreate to keep the civilization alive. But then, that can become a liability to us. It's causing us more harm than good. Now, the one advantage with alcohol and drugs is that we don't need alcohol and drugs. We don't need alcohol and drugs to survive. That is the only difference, and it's quite a difference between recovering from an alcohol and a drug problem and a food and a sex and a gambling and a relationship problem, where those are things that are part of life. If we look at what the AA literature says to us, our basic instincts are the things that get warped and twisted out of shape as a result of our disease. This is what causes us resentment. Relationships, security, ambition, self-esteem. These are the things that are the basis of our resentments. So, I guess what I'm saying is that we are working upstream. We are working against a universe that is in a state of entropy to achieve our higher goals and our higher purpose. Why? To what end? If I share my experience around that, my experience is clarity of vision and clarity of perspective. Being able to see I've been looking a little bit, and you'll have to forgive me if you've heard this stuff from me before. I've been looking a little bit at the religion of Hinduism, and from what I can understand, the ultimate goal of that religion is the quest for truth, understanding truth. That is what the ultimate goal is, and that ties in so much with what I believe, with what my life philosophy is, because that is what my quest in life is what am I seeing? Is what I'm seeing real, or am I delusional? Am I seeing things that are not there and putting things together in my life that make absolutely no sense? And then making decisions based on those delusions, and then wondering why everything is in chaos. Is that how I function? And that is how I have functioned. So it is quite possible to be sober and to not understand truth. Quite possible to do that. But to have clarity of vision and to have clarity of perspective makes life so much easier. The example that is always given in AA meetings that I think about that makes so much sense to me is, I have the map book of Cape Town, and I'm trying to find my way around Joburg, and I have absolutely no idea why I can't find where I'm going. And I'm wondering why life is happening to me the way that life is happening to me. The very real struggle of moving from not understanding to understanding is only achievable, I believe, through one avenue. There's only one avenue that is open to us to understand truth. And that is humility. That is to be humble. Lots of people, even Plato, and I'll try to recall the way that he puts it in context, is what he was saying is that the deflation of our ego, and there's so much confusion around that word and what that means. And I sit here in the treatment center and I talk to people a lot about ego. And when I ask them, do you know what does ego mean to you? And every single person that I speak to always says to me, I think that I'm better than everybody else. That's not what ego means at all. Ego is that part of ourselves in our minds that thinks that we know what's going on. That part of ourselves that doesn't have the humility to listen and to try and understand. Now, my own struggles with humility and my own perspective and the things that I've learned around that is that it's a very, very hard way to learn. It's a very, very, very difficult path to be humble. Because everything inside of me rebels at saying that I'm wrong and that I don't know what I'm doing. And everything inside of me rebels at the way that I start to feel under certain circumstances. And this is the real challenge. If I become completely overwhelmed with the way that I'm feeling emotionally, can I bear that emotion and still be conscious? That is a very, very, very real struggle. Now, the real question comes in here is, can willpower be learned? Can we learn how to have more willpower? Some people believe that we've given a certain amount of willpower during the day, and as the day goes on, it wears out. Can we recharge that battery? Can we keep the levels up? Can we, how do we, is that even a possibility? Is that even true? And people are doing experiments like this experiment with a bag of marshmallows to try and identify it and to try and understand if these things are a reality or if they're not a reality. Can I use willpower to stay away from alcohol and drugs? Is that what is required? I don't know. I don't know if that is what is required. If we look at what I was talking about in the beginning with these athletes that are operating at a very, very high level, and the psychological barriers that they are faced with, how much willpower is necessary to bear the burden of suffering? I don't know if very much is needed. You just have to. It's a part of life. It's the way that the universe is set up. Is we are going to struggle, and it is going to feel like we are swimming upstream. And when we're not swimming upstream, enjoy it, because there will come a time where you're going to be swimming upstream again. Now, there's a chap that I've been following called Wim Hof. I don't know if has anybody heard of Wim Hof? Wim Hof is a Hollander, a Dutchman from the Netherlands. And he's this guy who swims under the glaciers and swims with icebergs. I mean, when you see this guy where he swims, he spent an hour and a half in a cylinder filled with ice. he holds the world record for spending the most time in the cold. And he's got some very, very interesting ideas around survival. So one of the things that he's saying, and this is a little bit of my spin and my interpretation on what he's speaking about, is in the last 100 years, our society has improved so much. The poverty levels have decreased dramatically. The amount of people who have access to hospitals has increased exponentially. All of us sitting here are in that, they talk about the 1% of people who have all the money. That's us. We, the 1%. There's so much evidence in how dramatically life has improved for everybody in the last 100 years. But that means a hop, skip, and a jump ago, we were living in very, very different times. And I think everybody knows this. You go look at the photos of people in the 30s, they were all starving and dirty and living in, these dumps with 15 children, and everybody was poor. Nobody had any money. Everybody was starving all the time. Times were hard. Nobody had any clothes. You had one outfit, and that was it. And you were lucky if you had shoes. Things were tough. There was an element of survival taking place that had been taking place for thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years. We were cold. Physically, temperature-wise, cold. Not like today where everybody's got a nice down jacket with goose feathers in it. Never mind what happens to the poor goose. And enough to eat. They say one of the hugest contributions to greenhouse gases is our cows for our consumption. It's crazy. Also, on a much more sad note, something that really makes me think is they say that the most abused animal in the world is the chicken, which is it's a terrible thing. So we have so much luxury and we have so much excess around us. If you go back 100 years, 200 years, there's a reason why small children are afraid of the dark. There's a reason for that. Because there was 100 or 200 years of very good reasons to be afraid of the dark, because just now some hyena or a lion or a tiger will come and eat you. That's why. Be careful going from the house to the toilet, because you might not come back. That's why we're afraid of the dark. It's instinctually in us. Wim Hof is a yoga practitioner. He practices yoga. And part of his yoga practice is a very specific breathing technique. And the very specific breathing technique reminds me very, very much of somebody who is running away from a saber-toothed tiger. It's one of the things that the yogis is very similar to a yogi a breathing technique. And what it does is it gets your adrenaline system, your adrenal system working. And the cold. So in essence, if you're suffering with your lower nature, you can take yourself physically back 100 years. And you can think for yourself if you've been chased through the bushes by a saber-toothed tiger. Chased through the bushes by a saber-toothed tiger, how wakker are you going to be? You're going to be wide awake and you're going to know exactly what's going on around you. And if you are cold, when I used to write exams, I make sure that I don't have a jacket on and that I'm cold, so that my attention is nicely focused on what it is that I'm doing. So it's possible to influence your body this way. So I've kind of skimmed a little bit like a stone across a lake over the spiritual elements of surrender and letting go, which are so vitally important. But there are some things that we can do. So I'm going to give you, because the group is, I've got 1 minute left. I'm going to give you the crash course in the Wim Hof method. Okay, just in case you're interested in practicing it. If you want to know more, come and speak to me, and I'll tell you some more about it. What he does is he does a breathing exercise. So he takes 30 deep breaths, and on the last exhale, he holds his breath for as long as he can. And then breathes in. When he can't hold his breath any longer, breathes in for 15 seconds. And he does that 3 times. He does that when he wakes up, and then he jumps into a cold shower. As cold as he can bear. That's the tough part. And that's the part that I'm still adjusting to, especially in this weather. Cold as he can. I mean, he's swimming in the frickin' glaciers. But it really does impact on your consciousness. So I'm going to show you. I'll show you the breathing, and then we can end the group. That you guys have the information. If you want me to write it out on the board so that you can remember it, I'll do that as well. Now, ideally, what you want to do is you want to do it when you wake up. It's quite a thing, because remember, with any meditation practice, it's about consistency. It's not about doing it for 2 weeks and leaving it. If you can only meditate for 5 minutes, but you can continually do that for 5 minutes, then do that. And then add a minute at a time, and a minute at a time, and then build it up to the 15 minutes that they recommend for the meditation. All right? It's exactly the same with this breathing method. I do it 3 times a week. I do it on a Monday morning, on a Wednesday morning, and on a Friday morning when I wake up. When I wake up, well, obviously I wake up a bit early, my alarm goes off, I do this exercise, and I jump in the shower, and I start with the water a little bit lukewarm, and as I shower I go as cold as I can. The idea is to go straight into the cold and leave the cold and get out of the cold. All right, I'm working towards